I didn't have a flak jacket in those days. I didn't have a helmet. I had no protection whatsoever against any shrapnel or bullets or anything. We were never given anything. We were never given any training. I was never given any training. It was just a question of one day you're covering a court case at the High Court, the next day you're in a war zone. This was frontline stuff. This was pioneering stuff. No one intends to end up as a war correspondent. That's the kind of odd thing. But no, I started on local newspaper in London and then went to work for the London Evening Standard for a while. When they had a new regime at the Daily Telegraph, I was headhunted to join their team. They wanted new, younger people in, and they wanted more women because it was predominantly men. I think when I walked into the office, I was one of 3 women in an office of about 65 men. I was sent off, I think, to start with. I hadn't been there very long, and I was sent to Kuwait to cover a hostage crisis. And because I think I did well there, they decided that I would be good to go back to the Middle East. And that then led to about 3 or 4 years non-stop back and forth, including the first Gulf War. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on 2nd of August 1990, and I was on a plane that night. And I really didn't come home until about January. I was there for pretty much the whole time, first in Jordan, waiting to be allowed in by the authorities. And then once I was allowed in and given a sort of work visa, my job was to stay there, to report on everything and to make sure that I could stay there, because a lot of people were not allowed to stay for very long. The Americans had given Saddam Hussein a deadline of January to get out of Kuwait. And as the deadline loomed, it became more and more tense. One of the first things Saddam Hussein did was take hostages. He kept a group of British hostages in a hotel and wouldn't allow them home, and they were called human shields. And Saddam Hussein was basically showing the world, I've got these people, and we could keep them or kill them. And there had been a journalist for The Observer who had gone out earlier that year, a chap called Farzad Bazoft. And when he went exploring, he was arrested, and despite pleas from the British government, he was hanged. So it was a dangerous thing to be there. It was a very dangerous place to go, especially dangerous as a journalist. So I was very aware of what was going to happen and potentially could happen. But the adrenaline kicks in, and ego, and ambition. And so I was eager to go in the first instance, really eager to go. I think people think it's incredibly glamorous, and especially if you're a woman, they sort of have this idea that you're lording it over the men in this sort of, frontline situation. But there is absolutely nothing glamorous about living with no water. 1 bottle or 2 bottles of water a day, and that was to sort of brush your teeth and try and clean yourself as best you can. No electricity, and so you had to make sure you could get candles from somewhere. I lived on tinned tuna and hard-boiled eggs, which was provided by the hotel. We were in the Al Rashid Hotel. Once you get there, you hit the ground running, because you've got to find a translator, you've got to find a driver, you've got to find a car that's reliable, that's not going to abandon you or leave you or break down in the middle of the desert. And you've got to juggle the authorities, who are no doubt watching you very closely. And it may well be that your driver is working for them anyway, and the translator is almost certainly working for them. And then, of course, there's the vulnerability of a woman traveling alone. I always would put a chair up against the door of my hotel. I was always aware that there may well be surveillance cameras within the room, so I would just undress and dress in the dark always. And if somebody was outside your room at night making noise or banging on your door, which happened frequently, you had to handle all that and not sort of go under. You have to be extraordinarily cautious, but also quite pushy. And it got to the point with the Iraqis that I was really one of the few women there, and certainly the only woman who was operating solo. And they kind of admired that, I think, and also I was so young. And they used this wonderful expression. They called me Madame Wendy Sir, and said I was a big cheese, as they put it. Once you're sitting down with somebody or face-to-face with somebody who you have sought out to get your information from so that you can write a think piece or a proper report, without being just fed information by the authorities, which of course is another element of that. You have to decide about on how far you're going to press somebody, or even if you're going to press them at all. Because obviously if a mother's just had 2 of her children killed, as did happen in one situation, the last person she's going to want to talk to is a reporter, one would think. But actually, in that situation, she did want to talk straight away because she wanted to complain and she wanted the West to see what was happening. So you have to judge the situation. You learn to assess people incredibly quickly. You become very, very astute at judging people. Mostly I was completely on my own, apart from I had a wonderful driver, Brahim, who I still worry about and think about and would have liked to have kept in touch. But after the war, of course, had I got in touch with him, I might have jeopardised his family because he would have been seen to have been collaborating with the British forces. So he was very reliable, and I don't think he was working for the government. I think he was vetted by them, but I don't think he was. And then if we were in a group situation, so we were taken all over the country, we were taken to Mosul and Kirkuk and various things after the war, because the war was actually for a very limited period of time, and then I was one of the first people back in after the war, and we were taken to all the various places to see the damage, to see what had happened, and to see what had gone on with the civil war that broke out there, which was absolutely horrendous. But there were instances that I just went out on my own, or I went out on my own with my driver to try and find somebody to talk to about something. And there was a huge risk with that. I would read it aloud to a copy taker over this satellite phone, and they would type it up. And this is pre-mobile phones and pre any of the technology we have now. So you have to have an arrangement with either, it was usually BBC or ITV, to be able to borrow their satellite phone, hire it effectively, so the Telegraph at home would pay. And I think it was $350 a minute for me to file my copy. After the war, when, as often happens with war, particularly in the Middle East, when Western countries invade without understanding tribal mentality and realize that the people in charge are despots for a reason. They're despots because they have hundreds of different tribes and they have to try and keep them all together and corral them all together. That's not a justification of what they do, but that's why it happens. And in Libya and in Iraq and in all these places that they go into, if they take the leaders out, then there's a civil war because there's nobody to control them anymore. And so we were taken to see some pretty horrendous things that had happened, which they told us were to do with the civil war, the Shias fighting the Sunnis and so on. But we also were aware that the government was going in and brutally murdering anybody who rose up against them. And so the difficulty was to say at that point who was doing what to whom, but the burial pits we were shown and the torture chambers we were shown it was very clear that something absolutely dreadful had happened, and systematically in a way that was really quite gruesome and unreportable, a lot of it, because it was just too much. I took them all myself, obviously apart from the ones where I handed my camera, my trusty Pentax, to somebody else and had them take it. And I'm one of those people, if you put a camera in front of my face, I smile, regardless of sort of where I am. So it does look a bit odd sometimes. There I am with, some Iraqi soldiers, if they've got the red berets on, they were meant to be the Republican Guard, the arch, terrible sort of Saddam's terrible army, but they weren't at all. It's very difficult, particularly, as I said, when the government were telling us that this was infighting and nothing to do with them, but we were aware that it wasn't. There's nothing beats going and seeing for yourself. And there is one photograph here that was actually quite important. So this was a torture chamber. This is the floor of a torture chamber. And in this disgusting room, which still haunts my dreams, on the floor of this dreadful place was this ID card for a teenage boy. And he had obviously perished in there, and it was no two ways about it. But tellingly, next to it was an army jacket. And there are things like that you realize that they're telling you that this is not anything to do with them, but somebody has taken his jacket off before he's done something to that boy. And I picked up that ID card and I handed it to the authorities when I got home, back to Baghdad. I say home, that's what it was like by then, because I wanted them to know that I knew, and I had a photograph of it. And they said, oh no, it was probably somebody who was there and just dropped it. And they immediately dismiss it. So they're going to lie. They're going to say what did or didn't happen as far as their narrative is concerned. And you have to report what you see impartially, with a caveat that you have been told that this was, and you have to let the viewer, reader decide. That's really all you can do. We were flying down in the military helicopter, and Jim Baker was the Defense Secretary, American Defense Secretary at the time, and he had decided to fly in and have a look at what was happening and what was going on with the post-war. And we were suddenly in our military Iraqi helicopter flanked by two Americans who were signaling for the pilot to put the helicopter down immediately because there was a no-fly zone because Jim Baker was flying in. And the pilot panicked and he crash-landed the helicopter. And we crash-landed on the edge of the Shatt al-Arab Canal in Basra. And at this point, the rebels were really fighting down there. And we could hear the fighting, and we knew how things would be if they came upon us, because we were in a military helicopter with members of the Iraqi military. And this would not bode well for them, and it certainly wouldn't bode well for us, and it probably wouldn't bode well for me as the only woman. So for 3 days we were stuck there until they were able to get a coach to us to bring us out. And we ran out of water, so we had to drink from the canal, which gave us all terrible stomachaches, upsets, and we had no means of communication. And so there were these 3 days where they did not know if I was alive or dead. And to be completely honest with you, I wrote a letter to my husband and put it in the bottom of my shoe, because I did think that there was a chance I might not see him again. But fortunately, the coach came and we managed to get out, and it was a lucky escape. We were in a traffic jam of refugees. That's where these other photographs were taken, the same traffic jam. And we were, nobody was moving. And the reason nobody was moving was because this tank had been bombed, shot from above, and was blocking the road. And so the soldiers were milling around that part, and of course there we were, Westerners, with cameras and microphones and a whole TV crew. And they were just fascinated. They just came sort of running up to us and excited. And then we just posed for photographs with them like any sort of selfie, Obviously we were taken to see the Death Highway. That was a horrible thing. A whole convoy of vehicles, including military, but also civilian vehicles, was strafed and bombed, and at least 300 died there. And we were taken to see it very soon afterwards, and it was a terrible sight. Women and children and lots of soldiers, obviously, burned to a crisp, basically. And we were taken to a palace that was in Kerbala. In Kerbala, where in this particular room, it was where they hanged people. And there's this very, very ornate chair, like an ormolu gold chair, which was presumably taken out of the palace somewhere else, on which they would stand people. They rigged up a noose above it, and then they pushed the chair away. Sometimes when you're seeing something really terrible, like a torture chamber or a dead body, sometimes by holding a camera up to your face and looking at it through a lens, it takes away the immediacy of it. And that's a strange thing to say, but I think many photographers and camera crew would tell you the same thing. You are somehow removed from it. It's as if you're looking at it through a third person. And I think that sometimes helped too. And it gave you a chance to steady yourself, because obviously there I am, surrounded by men largely, very deeply moved by this, and I'm an easy weeper. I mean, I'm easy to tears. But it was not appropriate for me to break down. And so you can take a moment and hold the camera and just compose yourself for a little bit. I think PTSD is a very real condition and a lot of military suffer from it dreadfully. The story goes that journalists don't really get PTSD. And I don't know if that's entirely true. I've heard it said a number of times. There was a lot of drinking went on, I know that. After every day of like this, we would go back to somebody's suite and there was a lot of heavy drinking went on. And unfortunately, a lot of journalists in that situation, I know, have become alcoholics and have died of it. Marriages certainly often don't survive it. Fortunately, mine did, and I didn't become an alcoholic. In fact, I wasn't even drinking then, I don't think. But when I came back from all of this, on my first night home, I had such a violent nightmare that I broke my husband's ribs. And I have since broken his ribs, I think, twice more. I have thrown myself down the stairs twice. I broke my ankle very badly. I broke my finger punching a wall. I tried to throw myself out of a window to get away from something in my dream. And we now have mountaineering ropes across the top of the stairs, all these years later, 30 odd years later, to stop me throwing myself down the stairs again. These things should have an after effect, because if they don't, how are you going to be able to feel what the reader should feel when they read them, or the viewer should see and feel when they see these pictures and see other things that go on. So I don't regret having it. I think my husband probably does, but I don't regret having it, but I do, it is something I live with for sure. Some of them are very shocking. They're more shocking to me, perhaps because there's certain things I couldn't even take photographs of. And I look at that picture and I can smell it again. And I can feel the squelch underneath my shoes, which I took off and burned as when I got back. So yes, they are shocking, but unfortunately, man's inhumanity to man is continuing. It's continuing now all over the world in ways that we don't even see, and we would probably never have seen these. We would never have even known, and this sort of thing continues, and it needs to stop, and it needs to be written about, and it needs to be spoken about, and it needs to be remembered. I think in a way it kind of led me to the writing that I'm doing now, because I think it informs my writing, and it makes me compassionate, and it makes me understand what it is that I'm writing about. My latest book is the first ever authorized biography of Audrey Hepburn, and I was asked by her son to help him write it because of my wartime experience, because Audrey's life began and ended with war. So he wanted me to go there because I had been in refugee camps and because I knew what war did to women and children particularly, which was her passion. And I could write about it in a moving way. So everything happens for a reason.